40 warships crawl across a flat, indifferent sea. Steel hulls, thin armor, hundreds of men on each one. Above them, the sky is too clear, too blue. It's the kind of perfect flying weather that makes every sailor nervous. They know what clear skies mean. Somewhere over that horizon are enemy aircraft warming up their engines, checking their bombs, waiting for the word. On the bridge of one destroyer, an officer grips the rail and squints into the distance. The order has already gone out. Prepare to lay smoke. All ships stand by to execute. There's a plan. The Navy has spent years and millions building it. Specialized smoke generators, careful doctrine, charts that tell you how many units you need, how fast to go, how wide a screen you get. On paper, it all works. But there's a problem. These generators are heavy. They're mounted where they fit, not always where you need them. There aren't enough of them to cover an entire formation this big, this spread out. And as the first blips start to crawl across the radar scope, it becomes horribly clear. 40 destroyers will not be able to disappear in time. So the men on those ships start doing what humans always do when the official plan isn't enough. They improvise. On one of those destroyers, the key to the entire day is not in the engine room or the plotting room or even on the bridge. It's in the galley. In a hot, cramped kitchen wedged low in the hull, where a 24-year-old cook stares at a smoking pan of oil and realizes, if the Navy's expensive smoke generators can't hide this fleet, maybe he can. With a frying pan and diesel fuel. What would you do if you were that cook? Would you keep your head down and stir the beans? Or would you risk your rank, your reputation, and maybe your life to tell the officers above you that their big official solution isn't good enough? Keep that question in the back of your mind, because by the time this story is over, 40 destroyers will owe their survival to a trick born not in a laboratory, but over a greasy stove. And if that sounds far-fetched, stick with me, because this is not a story about gadgets. It's a story about where ideas come from, and who we listen to when everything is on the line. To understand how a cook's kitchen smoke screen could even matter, you first have to understand why navies cared so much about smoke. For thousands of years, smoke was just a byproduct. Fires burned, ships moved under sail, cannons belched powder, and the smoke was simply there. But by the early 20th century, militaries started to realize something. If you could control smoke, if you could create it on demand in the right place and at the right time, you could disappear. You could blind an enemy's gun crews, hide your ships during a torpedo run, or cover a retreat. By World War II, the art of the smoke screen was a science. Naval officers carried tables that told them, at X knots with Y smoke generators, you can lay a curtain of smoke Z yards wide that will last this many minutes in this wind. There were dedicated smoke units. Big cylindrical generators that injected special oil into red-hot exhaust or burned chemicals that produced thick white clouds. They were heavy, complicated machines designed by men with degrees in chemistry and engineering, and they worked under test conditions, calm seas, predictable wind, controlled speed. The problem was war almost never cooperated. Destroyers especially had a dilemma. They were the greyhounds of the fleet, fast, lightly built, crammed with guns, torpedoes, radar sets, depth charges, ammunition, fuel. To them, every ton mattered. So the first priority for these small ships was always weapons, then propulsion, then the critical systems that kept them afloat. Smoke generators, useful, desirable. But not always installed in the numbers planners wished they had. On some missions, a few generators had to do the work of many. On others, a squadron might be tasked with screening a huge area with barely enough equipment to cover themselves. On a clear, bright day with enemy bombers inbound, that gap between theory and reality could get men killed. Now, put yourself in the boots of a young enlisted sailor on one of those destroyers. You don't attend tactical conferences. You don't see the memos about smoke doctrine. You live down where the work is done. Maybe in the engine room, maybe in the magazines, or maybe in the galley. That's where our story really begins. His name in the official records is hard to find. It's buried in after-action reports and damage control summaries if it's mentioned at all. so for our purposes, we'll call him Sam. Sam didn't join the Navy to become a hero. He joined for a hot meal and a steady paycheck. Before the war, he'd been a short-order cook at a truck stop off a dusty highway. The kind of place where you stand over a grill for 10 hours a day, working 6 pans at once, flipping eggs with one hand and wiping sweat off your neck with the other. If you've ever worked a kitchen, you know the rules. Don't waste anything. Don't stop moving. And if it breaks, you fix it with whatever's within arm's reach. Sam brought that mindset with him when he put on a uniform. By 1944, he was a ship's cook on a destroyer in the Pacific. His world was steam, heat, and constantly not quite enough of anything. He woke up before dawn, fired up the galley, and started cooking for a crew that lived on coffee, cigarettes, and whatever the supply chain had managed to get through the submarines and storms. His days were long. His rank was low, and like a lot of enlisted men, he saw things the officers didn't. He saw how the ship really behaved under strain. How the ventilation pulled air through the passageways. How steam and smoke moved when the engines were pushed to flank speed. How the whole steel box reacted when the ship swung hard to port or starboard. He might not have known the math for fluid dynamics, but he had thousands of hours in front of hot oil and open flames, and that counted for more than anyone realized. One morning, just after dawn, Sam was deep in the usual chaos of breakfast. On a destroyer, breakfast is an operation. 2 sittings, sometimes 3. Men cycling through the mess hall as fast as you can sling eggs and spoon oatmeal. The griddle was full. Pans were jammed onto every burner. Bacon fat popped and hissed. Somebody had stacked a crate of potatoes too close to the stove because there was literally nowhere else to put it. It was crowded, loud, and hot. Too hot. Sam turned to shout for more coffee mugs, and that's when it happened. A pan, a little too full of oil, flared, just a small flare at first. Nothing he hadn't seen 100 times in the diner back home. He reached for a lid to choke it off. Then the ship rolled, just a gentle swell under the bow, enough to slosh the oil. The flame licked higher, caught a film of grease on the back wall of the stove, and in about 3 seconds, Sam's world turned gray. The vents kicked in. Fans whirred to full speed, trying to pull the smoke out of the galley. Only this wasn't cigarette smoke. It was thick, oily, black. It rolled up across the overhead, boiled past the fluorescent lights, and got sucked into the ship's ventilation ducts like a living thing. Men coughed and cursed. A petty officer bolted in, eyes wide, shouting, "What the hell are you doing, Sam, cooking the ship?" Sam got the lid on the pan, killed the flames, and the worst of it died down. But for the next 2 or 3 minutes, that soot-filled smoke kept crawling through the vents and into places it really didn't belong. Into the passageway outside the mess. Into the companionway leading down to the engine room. Men opened hatches and swore as it seeped in. The fan might have been trying to clear the mess, but all it did was spread the problem around. By the time it was over, Sam was ashamed, sweaty, and convinced he was about to be chewed out publicly. But as he stood there, watching that last smear of greasy smoke creep toward the vent intake, another thought pushed its way in. He had just by accident filled a good portion of the ship with opaque black smoke using 1 pan, a few cups of oil, and the ductwork the ship already had. He'd seen official smoke screens laid before, out on deck with generators hissing their clouds into the wind. They were impressive in a clean, almost artificial way. White or gray walls of vapor carefully placed astern of the ship as she moved. But this was different. This smoke hugged surfaces. It clung. It obscured everything. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And some half-ridiculous, half-terrifying idea took root in his brain. If a little pan of galley oil could do this inside the ship, what could we do if we kicked this smoke out into the open air? Could we hide? If you've ever had an idea that you're not sure is stupid or brilliant, you know the feeling that came next. Sam finished the breakfast rush. He cleaned the stove, scrubbed the wall, and did his best to look contrite when the chief came by to growl at him about turning my galley into a tire fire. But the thought wouldn't let go. That afternoon, during a lull, he caught one of the junior officers coming through the mess. An ensign, Young, still had that look of someone who remembered what it was like to be scared and new. "Sir," Sam said, wiping his hands on a towel, "can I ask you something about smoke?" The ensign probably expected a question about cigarettes. Instead, he got a strange, halting proposal from a low-ranking cook about deliberately burning oil in the galley to make a weapon. Sam did his best to explain the way the vents had sucked the smoke out, the density of it, how quickly it had spread. If they could rig a way to push that smoke out onto the deck through an access hatch or a vent cowling, they might be able to create an emergency smoke source at almost no cost. The ensign frowned. That's not how it's supposed to work. We've got generators for that, special fuel, procedures." "I know, sir," Sam said, "but we don't have a lot of them, and they're all aft. If we needed smoke forward fast—" He trailed off, suddenly aware of his place. He was a cook. This was not his lane. What he was doing, telling an officer, however politely, that the proper equipment might not be enough, was more than just socially awkward. In the wartime Navy, it was borderline insubordinate. The ensign shifted, looking down the passageway as if someone might have overheard. "Look," he said, lowering his voice, "you're not wrong that we're light on generators, and that flare-up this morning definitely made an impression, but setting fires on purpose, that's how ships die." He paused. "Still," he added, "maybe there's something there. I'll mention it to the lieutenant." Now, pause here for a second and ask yourself, if you were that ensign, what would you do? You've got doctrine, manuals, and a chain of command above you that expects you to follow them. You've got a cook below you with no formal training in anything but onions and eggs, and yet he's suggesting a solution to a problem that you know exists. Who do you trust? The expert consensus? Or the guy who literally just smoked out half your compartment by accident? That tension between official knowledge and lived experience is where this story really lives. Because this was not the only time in the war when someone at the bottom saw something the top had missed. A machinist's mate named Thomas read Sullivan did something similar with a little pump called the P-60, improvising new ways to fight flooding when his ship was supposed to be dead. Time and again in World War II, low-ranking sailors quietly bent or broke the rules to save their ships. The hard part wasn't having the idea. The hard part was getting anyone to listen. Word of Sam's kitchen smoke notion did reach higher up the chain, first as the punchline to a joke. You hear about the cook who wants to defend the fleet with bacon grease. But there was also that memory of the corridor filling with soot, the way it had limited visibility to almost zero. So one evening, in relatively calm seas with no enemy nearby, the lieutenant in charge of Sam's division made a decision. We'll try it. Once. Controlled. If you're picturing a formal test with clipboards and stopwatches, forget it. This was more like a half-authorized prank. They picked a spot on deck well away from ammunition lockers and fuel lines. They ran a short length of ducting from an access in the galley vent up to a makeshift hood made from scrap metal. They hauled up a heavy steel pan, the kind normally used for soup, and set it on a couple of fire bricks. Into it they poured a mixture of used cooking oil and a little diesel, just enough to thin it out. Sam stood there with a rag in his hand, heart pounding, waiting for someone to call the whole thing off. Instead, the lieutenant nodded. "Okay, do it." Sam struck a match. The flame caught with a soft whoomp, then built. The oil shimmered, then began to smoke, slowly at first, then more. The greasy vapor gathered under the makeshift hood, got drawn into the duct, and was spat out onto the open deck a few feet away. Every man standing there took a step back. The stuff rolled out in a thick, tar-black curtain, not the pale, wispy haze of a cigarette, not the white, almost pretty clouds of the official smoke canisters. This was like watching a wall of burnt rubber ooze into existence. Within about 30 seconds, the side of the ship where the wind carried it was cloaked. Looking out from the deck, the ocean vanished into a featureless gray-black smear. Looking back from the smoke toward the ship, the superstructure took on a ghostly, shifting outline. In that moment, the men on deck felt something that is hard to capture in a manual, possibility. "Jesus," someone muttered, "this actually works." The lieutenant squinted through the haze. "All right," he said. "Good enough. Shut it down before we set the whole Pacific on fire." They doused the pan, ventilated the space, and pretended for the rest of the watch that nothing unusual had happened. But sailors talk. Within days, variations of the story had made it to other ships in the squadron. Some officers scoffed. Others were intrigued. One or two sent quiet notes up the chain about improvised galley-based smoke generation methods. The responses, when they came, were polite but firm. Smoke doctrine existed for a reason. Fuels were allocated carefully. Fire risk was not to be taken lightly. Field expedients, while admirable in spirit, were discouraged unless absolutely necessary. Translation: we have experts, we have equipment, we don't need the cooks setting things on fire to help. And most of the time they didn't, but war has a way of ignoring memos. Weeks passed. The squadron, 40 destroyers strong at full muster, though numbers rose and fell with damage, repairs, and reassignments, went about its brutal, grinding business. Convoy escort, shore bombardment, anti-submarine patrols. They were the thin, ever-present screen around the big capital ships, the carriers and battleships that drew enemy attention like magnets. On more than one occasion, Japanese bombers and torpedo planes had probed their defenses. On those days, the official smoke generators had been switched on. Men watched white clouds spill out behind them, carefully plotted to intersect the expected path of incoming planes. And it helped, sometimes, but not always. Sometimes the wind shifted unexpectedly. Sometimes the speed of the formation had to change at the last minute, throwing off the carefully calculated thickness of the screen. Sometimes there just weren't enough generators fired in time to cover everyone. And in the quiet after each attack, after the bombs that missed and the ones that didn't, men like Sam would hear the gunners and officers talk. We needed more cover. They could still see our wakes. If we'd had another minute of smoke on the starboard flank. Sam listened and kept his mouth shut. After that one semi-official test, the kitchen smoke idea had been gently but definitely pushed back into its box. He went back to peeling potatoes, scrambling eggs, washing pans. He didn't have credentials. What he had, according to the Navy, was a job: feed the ship. Then came the day when that job unexpectedly became something very different. The morning started deceptively calm. The destroyer squadron was stretched out in a scythe-shaped screen several miles wide. Some ships rode close in to protect a group of slower transports. Others angled further out, watching for submarines and prowling always for the first sign of aircraft. The sea was a hard, polished blue. There was just enough breeze to raise little white caps and keep the exhaust from choking the decks. On paper, it was a commander's dream. Good visibility, moderate seas, a formation neatly dressed and sailing more or less as planned. On the radar scopes, it was a nightmare waiting to happen. Shortly after mid-morning, the first faint blips appeared. Single dots at long range, then clusters, then more. The operator's voice went tight. "Multiple air contacts, bearing 095, range increasing, sir." By the time the report reached the flagship, the pattern was obvious. This wasn't a stray scout flight. It was a raid. Orders crackled across the squadron. All ships, general quarters, air attack imminent. Lay smoke as directed. On Sam's destroyer, claxons wailed. Men sprinted to battle stations. Hatches slammed. The ship bristled with activity as guns were manned, ammo was passed, radars swung to track. Up on the bridge, the captain looked at the plot. 40-odd destroyers and escorts. A handful of bigger ships, cruisers maybe, beyond the horizon, a convoy that needed protection, and a sky full of incoming. The standard playbook called for smoke, lots of it. If you could shroud the convoy in a shifting fog, you could at least force attacking pilots to rely on guesswork instead of precise aiming. But there were problems, and every man on that bridge could see them. The generators they had were mounted aft. The convoy was long. The line of destroyers was stretched. The wind, at that particular hour, was coming almost dead off the beam instead of from astern. That meant that their neat, trailing curtains of smoke would blow sideways instead of back over the ships they were meant to protect. You could change course to compensate, but that would scatter the formation and play havoc with the gunners firing arcs. And there simply were not enough heavy smoke units to lay a continuous wall for 40 ships. The captain swore under his breath. "Get what we can going," he ordered. "We'll tie into whatever the others put up." The official smoke generators roared to life, spraying their opaque clouds into the wind. On the plotting table, an officer traced the likely paths of those clouds against the expected flight path of the attackers. Even in best-case assumptions, there were gaps, holes, pieces of the convoy that would stand out in the clear like targets on a range. Down in the guts of the ship, Sam heard the alarms and felt the vibrato of engines winding up. He also heard something else, a snatch of conversation between a passing bosun and a gunner's mate. "We're not going to have enough smoke to cover the whole line." "Yeah," the gunner said. "We're going to be hanging out there naked on the bow while the aft gets all the fog." The words landed like a weight in Sam's stomach. He pictured very clearly the oily black curtain that had rolled out from his pan weeks before, how quickly it had taken effect, how thick it had been. He knew the risk, the warnings, the danger of open flame and fuel. But he also knew this. Bombs and torpedoes didn't care about policy. They cared about targets. And right now he was pretty sure that unless someone did something creative, there were going to be a lot of very easy targets out there. Sam hesitated. He could stay in his lane, stir the soup, pretend he hadn't heard, or he could do the most dangerous thing a low-ranking man can do in a rigid hierarchy. He could speak up. Again. This time, with no guarantee anyone would be as patient as that young ensign had been. He wiped his hands, took a breath, and headed for the ladder. The bridge of a warship at general quarters is a bad place to bother people with bad ideas. It's crowded, noisy. Every mind up there is juggling a dozen inputs at once. But Sam didn't try to go straight to the captain. He grabbed the first face he recognized, the same lieutenant who'd allowed that quiet test weeks before. The lieutenant turned, ready to bark at whoever had the nerve to interrupt him, and stopped. It was the cook. "Sir," Sam said, words tumbling. "Lieutenant, sir, this is about the smoke." The lieutenant opened his mouth, then closed it. He saw the fear in Sam's eyes, the conviction behind it. He also had a quick glimpse of the radar repeater, of the approaching mass of enemy planes, of the arcs on the map showing how little coverage their generators would buy them. "Make it fast," he said. Sam did. He reminded him of the test, the density of the galley smoke, the way it rolled, the fact that they could put smoke up forward where they currently had none, and maybe, just maybe, tie that thick black stuff into whatever the official generators were already producing. The risks were obvious. A fire out of control could cripple the ship before a single bomb fell. But the lieutenant had done one thing that most people in big organizations don't do very often. He had seen it work with his own eyes. And now, with the clock running down and enemy planes minutes away, he had to decide. Did he trust the book? Or did he trust what he'd seen in front of him on that quiet evening test? He turned to the captain. "Captain, permission to initiate an emergency smoke source forward via galley ventilation." The captain stared at him. "An emergency what?" The lieutenant didn't have time to walk through the whole story. "Sir, we ran a small-scale test, controlled, using the galley vent and burn pans. It produced a very dense smoke. We can push it out ahead of our normal generators, fill some of the gaps on the bow side." The captain glanced at the smoke chart, the wind, the blips. He was not a man inclined to gamble with his ship, but he was also not stupid. He knew that the war he had trained for and the war he was fighting were not always the same. "If that fire gets away from you," he began. "It won't, sir," the lieutenant said. "We'll station hoses, sand, we'll keep it contained. But if we do nothing, those bombers are going to have a clear view of the whole forward third of the formation." Silence, except for the murmur of bearings and ranges. Then the captain made the kind of decision that history rarely remembers by name, but men remember in their bones. "Do it," he said. And pass the word, any ship that can safely improvise additional smoke, do it, but keep it under control. Understood? Understood, sir. The lieutenant spun to Sam. You heard him. Get your kitchen smoking. Back in the galley, Sam and his mates moved faster than they had ever moved over a stove. They dragged out the heavy steel pans, the stock pots, anything with enough surface area to hold oil and burn hot. They yanked open the vent access that led to the forward cowls. One sailor hauled in jugs of used frying fat from the waste barrel. Another rolled in a drum of diesel, eyes wide. Sam grabbed a hose line and made sure it was charged and ready. On my word, he said, voice surprisingly steady. Light 'em. The first flame caught, then the second. Oil shimmered, then darkened. Within seconds, the air above the burners turned into a roiling, suffocating fog. The vent fans strained, hauling it up and out. On the deck above, men saw black smoke begin to pour from vents that had never smoked like that before. It belched across the foredeck, caught the wind, and curled outwards in a low, clinging blanket. From a distance, from the bridge of a neighboring destroyer, someone shouted, "What the hell just happened to Samson?" Or whatever name you give that ship. Within moments, messages were flashing across the squadron, brief, urgent, half-coded. Improvised smoke forward via galley vents effective. Repeat effective. Use extreme caution. Stand by hoses. On other ships, cooks and engineers who'd heard the rumors weeks earlier made eye contact. Think we can do it, one said. Think we have a choice. The other replied. And all along that long scythe of destroyers, men in kitchens and workrooms and fire rooms started lighting things on purpose that they'd spent their entire careers trying not to set on fire. Not haphazardly, not recklessly, but with a grim, precise focus born of survival. Burn pans on deck, carefully placed and ringed by men with hoses and extinguishers. Fuel thin just enough to smoke, not flash into open flame. Ventilation systems leveraged, not to keep the air clear, but to make it as filthy as possible in a very specific direction. From the air, it must have looked insane. One moment, a neat pattern of gray hulls on a blue sea. The next, shapes smearing and dissolving under erupting, irregular clouds of white and black, as official smoke generators and improvised kitchen screens mixed into one chaotic fog bank. In the cockpits of the incoming bombers, pilots squinted. Their briefing had shown them a convoy, visible ships, kill boxes to aim for. Instead, they saw a seething, uneven wall of smoke stretching much further and thicker than anticipated. Some broke formation to try and find a way around it. Others pressed in, trusting their gut. Inside that man-made storm on the decks of the destroyers, the world shrank. Gunners fired almost blind, using radar and radioed bearings. Officers barked ranges into squawk boxes, trying to build a mental picture from splintered information. Sam stayed in the galley. He watched the pans like a hawk, adjusting the fuel, keeping the smoke thick but the flames caged. Every few seconds, he glanced at the hose line, at the fire extinguishers lined up like soldiers. Above him, the ship shook as guns fired. The thump of exploding bombs echoed through the hull. At least once the lights flickered as a near miss hammered the sea close enough to rattle every rivet. Men yelled down reports, "Bomb off the port bow wide." Torpedo tracks lost in the haze. Plane overshot, couldn't see us until too late. Here's the thing about smoke in battle. It doesn't make you invulnerable. It just makes you harder to hit. Over the next furious half-hour, some ships in that formation were hit. Shrapnel scythed through plating. Antennas snapped. A gun mount took a near-direct hit and went silent. But not one destroyer in that main body was sunk. Later analysis would show patterns that are obvious only in hindsight. Bombs meant for the heart of the convoy landed long, short, wide. Pilots misjudged distances in the murk. Attack runs were sloppier, less coordinated. Some dove on shadows that turned out to be nothing but darker patches in the smoke. Others held their bombs too long, waiting for a clear view that never came. And turning back to base, more than a few of those pilots would grumble in their reports about unexpected heavy smoke coverage that had not been present on previous engagements. Unexpected, not from the point of view of the men who had poured it out of frying pans. On Sam's destroyer, the order finally came down. Cease smoke. All stations stand down to condition 2. He killed the burners. The last ribbons of greasy black vapor curled lazily up the vents and dissipated into the larger, whiter fog laid by the official generators. His arms ached. His throat burned. He leaned against the galley counter, listening to the ship slowly exhale from its battle tension. Through the deck, he could feel the difference in the engines as they throttled back. Out on the horizon, faint shapes emerged as the smoke drifted and thinned. Ships, still afloat, not all whole, but there, alive. In the hours that followed, formal messages flew, from captains to squadron commanders, from squadron staff to fleet, from fleet to the faceless offices back home where analysts tried to understand why some convoy attacks failed and others succeeded. Some of those messages mentioned, in a line or two, improvised smoke sources, and ad hoc augmentation of standard screens via galley exhaust and fuel oil combustion. Most of them did not mention any cooks by name. There were commendations written for gunners who shot down planes, for officers who maneuvered skillfully, for damage control teams who kept fires from spreading. All of that was deserved, but somewhere in the stack of carbon copies and smudged ink, the true genesis of that extra, unexpected layer of protection was reduced to an almost comically bland phrase. Use of field expedient measures. Field expedient. That's the bureaucratic way of saying, somebody somewhere broke the rules in exactly the right way at exactly the right time. Men like Sam went back to their duties. The next morning, he still had to get up before dawn and make breakfast for a ship full of hungry, exhausted sailors. Some of them slapped him on the back and joked about smoke-flavored soup. A few, who hadn't fully understood what he'd done, grumbled about the smell. The lieutenant made a point of stopping by the galley hatch. "Nice work yesterday," he said quietly. "Yes, sir," Sam replied, and that was that, no medal, no speech. No name on a citation that historians would later pore over. But the truth remained, on that day 40 destroyers sailed out of a kill zone that on paper they might well have not survived, because a cook had burned breakfast once and paid attention. So what do we do with a story like this? It would be easy to twist it into a slogan. The experts were wrong, the little guy was right. But that's not really what happened. The official smoke generators worked. The doctrine that developed them was based on real science, real experience. In many battles, they were the primary reason ships survived. The men who designed and deployed them weren't fools. They were doing their best within the constraints they had. Sam didn't replace them. He extended them. He saw the gap between what the system provided and what reality demanded, and he filled it with whatever was at hand. He didn't have a degree in chemistry. He didn't have clearance to sit in on tactical planning meetings. What he had was time in front of a stove, a memory for how smoke moved through steel compartments, and just enough courage to say to someone higher up than him, "Sir, I think there's another way," and to say it again when it mattered. If you strip away the uniforms and the specific technologies, you're left with a pattern that shows up in war after war, and in industry and in science, and probably in your own workplace too. Innovation doesn't only happen at the top. It happens in the engine room, in the mailroom, in the cubicle farm, in the parts of an organization where what we really do lives. The trick is not having the idea. People at the bottom have ideas all the time. The trick is getting those ideas past the filters that say, "That's not your job. We've never done it that way. The experts already solved this." During World War II, Thomas Red Sullivan looked at a small, underused pump on his ship and realized it could move water in ways the designers hadn't imagined, saving his vessel from sinking when the official methods failed. Sam looked at a smoking pan of oil and realized he could make a cloud big enough to hide a warship. They didn't have credentials. They had something harder to quantify, the willingness to be wrong in public, to be laughed at, to be told to shut up and go back to peeling potatoes. And sometimes, when the people above them were just flexible enough, that willingness translated into survival. So here's the uncomfortable question for all of us, watching this from the safety of a peacetime screen. Where in your world are you Sam? Are you the person who sees every day how the official way doesn't quite line up with reality on the floor? Is there a smoke screen you know how to lay, some quicker, cheaper, more practical fix that no one has asked you about? If so, what's stopping you from speaking up? Fear of looking stupid, of overstepping, of being told, stay in your lane. And if you happen to be the officer in this metaphor, the manager, the team lead, the person with the degree, ask yourself, when was the last time you really listened to the Sams around you? Not nodded politely and then filed their idea away under maybe later, but actually tried it, even on a small scale, even if it sounded at first blush a little bit crazy. Because history suggests something simple and a little bit humbling on the days that matter most, when the sky is too clear and the enemy is on the way. The idea that saves you might not come from the conference room. It might come from the kitchen. From a man with calloused hands, a stained apron, and smoke in his eyes who looks at the way things really are and says, I know this isn't how we're supposed to do it, but I've seen this work. And sometimes that's all the expertise you need. If you'd like to hear more hidden stories like Sam's, the quiet improvisations, the unsung fixes, the strange little hacks that change the course of battles, stick around. Because World War II was full of them. And behind almost every official victory, there was at least one frying pan, one jury-rigged pump, one piece of galley logic that never made it into the manuals, but made all the difference.